A group of friends on a camping trip discover footage from a trail camera showing a mysterious man with a machete circling their tents in the dead of night. You ever had one of those moments where everything feels perfect, like you're in the middle of a movie? That's how it felt when my friends and I decided to go camping in that forest. The air was so crisp, the trees stretched up like skyscrapers, and there wasn't a single sound of traffic. Just pure, untouched nature. That's what we wanted, a break from the chaos of city life. It was me, Alex, Mia, Ryan, and Jess. We've been best friends since college, and this trip was supposed to be our little reunion. Alex was the nature guy. He was always talking about birds and trail cameras and all that. He'd brought one with him, of course, saying something like, "You never know what cool animals we might see out here at the time." I thought it was just Alex being Alex. The first day was perfect. We hiked a bit, set up our tents near a small clearing, and spent the evening around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling dumb stories. Around midnight, the forest got quiet, like unnervingly quiet. It's weird when you're used to the city because you're so accustomed to background noise. Out there, nothing. Just the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant hoot from an owl. Alex set up his trail camera before we all crawled into our tents. He said he'd placed it on a tree about 30 feet from the campsite, pointing it toward the clearing, just in case he joked, like it was no big deal. That night I woke up to a sound. It was subtle at first, like footsteps crunching leaves, but it wasn't steady. It would stop and then start again, like whoever or whatever it was trying to be quiet. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something. But then I realized it wasn't coming from just one spot. The sound was moving around the tent. Slow, deliberate, like it was circling us. I whispered to Mia, who was in the tent with me. "Did you hear that?" She mumbled something about raccoons and fell back asleep. I tried to convince myself she was right, but my heart was racing. I stayed awake for what felt like forever, just listening, but eventually the sound stopped and I must have drifted off. The next morning I almost forgot about it until Alex checked the trail camera. He'd brought it over to the fire pit and was scrolling through the footage while we made breakfast. He stopped mid-sentence and went pale. "Guys," he said, his voice shaking, "you need to see this." We all huddled around, staring at the tiny screen on the camera. The first few clips were normal, a raccoon scuttling by, some birds, nothing unusual. But then there was a video from around 2 a.m. At first it was hard to make out. The clearing was dimly lit by the moon, and the camera's night vision made everything look grainy. But there was movement, a figure. It was a man. "Miss?" He was tall, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie and jeans. And he was holding something, a machete. He wasn't doing anything crazy like running or yelling. He was just walking, slowly, circling the campsite. At one point he stopped and looked directly into the camera, like he knew it was there. His face was partially covered by the hoodie, but you could see enough to know he was watching us. Then he turned and disappeared back into the trees. I felt like I couldn't breathe. That's got to be some kind of joke, right?" Ryan said, but his voice cracked, and we all knew he didn't believe it. We searched the area for footprints and found them all around the campsite, close to the tents. They were fresh, too. Whoever that guy was, he'd been there. He'd been watching us while we slept. We packed up in record time. No one said much. We were too busy looking over our shoulders, listening for any sound that might mean he'd come back. By the time we got to the car, the sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It should have been beautiful, but it felt menacing. On the drive back, Alex kept apologizing for bringing the trail camera. He said if he hadn't set it up, maybe we wouldn't have known. But honestly, I'm glad he did. I'd rather know the truth, no matter how terrifying it is. We never went back to that forest. In fact, we don't even talk about that trip much anymore. It's like we're all trying to forget, but every now and then, I'll catch myself wondering what would have happened if we hadn't woken up. If Alex hadn't set up that camera. And worst of all, is he still out there, watching someone else right now? A family camping at a remote lake encounters eerie whistling and a mysterious figure across the water, only to learn from a ranger that they're not the first to experience the unsettling phenomenon. So this happened a couple of summers ago. My family, me, my wife Lisa, and our 2 teenagers, Emily and Jake, decided to do something a little different for our annual vacation. Instead of the usual beach trip or theme park, we thought we'd get away from it all and go camping. We'd heard about this lake deep in the wilderness that was supposed to be incredibly peaceful. It was miles from any town, and you could only get to it by a long, winding dirt road. Perfect, right? No Wi-Fi, no distractions. Just us and nature. The drive there was beautiful but nerve-wracking. The road was narrow, with thick trees on either side, and it felt like we were driving deeper and deeper into nowhere. By the time we got to the lake, though, it was worth it. The water was like glass, reflecting the mountains and trees around it. Not another soul in sight. We picked a spot close to the shore, set up our tent, and spent the rest of the day fishing and kayaking. It was exactly what we needed. That first night, we sat around our little campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling silly stories. The stars were unbelievable, so many of them, it felt like you could reach up and grab one. Around 10 p.m., Emily pointed out a faint glow on the opposite side of the lake. At first, I thought it was just the moonlight catching the water, but then I realized it was a fire. A campfire. "Looks like we've got neighbors," I said, trying to sound casual. We hadn't seen anyone else on the drive-in or while we were setting up. Lisa shrugged it off, saying maybe they'd hiked in from another trail. It wasn't weird enough to really bother us, but it definitely caught our attention. As we sat there watching, the fire flickered, and we started hearing this. Whistling. It was faint, like whoever it was didn't want to be too loud. The tune was kind of repetitive, almost hypnotic, but off. Like it wasn't any song I'd ever heard before. Jake joked that it sounded like something out of a horror movie, and Lisa rolled her eyes, telling him not to freak Emily out. I laughed, but inside I felt a little uneasy. It's hard to explain. The whole thing just felt out of place. We decided to call it a night, figuring it wasn't worth overthinking. By the time we zipped up the tent, the fire across the lake had gone out, and the whistling had stopped. I didn't think much of it until I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why I was awake. The tent was quiet except for the sound of Lisa's steady breathing and the occasional rustle of the kids turning in their sleeping bags. Then I heard it, the same whistling, only this time it was closer. It wasn't loud, but it was definitely coming from our side of the lake. My heart started pounding. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or some kind of bird, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I lay there for what felt like forever, straining to hear more. Eventually it stopped, and I must have fallen back asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Over breakfast, I asked if anyone else had heard anything weird during the night. Lisa said no, but Emily's face went pale. "I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent," she said quietly. Jake rolled his eyes, calling her paranoid, but I could tell she was serious. I didn't want to scare her, so I just said it was probably an animal and left it at that. We spent the day hiking and swimming, trying to shake off the weird vibe from the night before. By the time the sun started setting, we were all exhausted. I was looking forward to another peaceful evening by the fire, but when we sat down, Emily froze. "Look," she whispered, pointing across the lake. The fire was back, and this time, there was no mistaking it. A figure was standing near it. We couldn't make out any details, just a tall, dark silhouette. Whoever it was stood there, perfectly still, staring in our direction. At least it felt like they were staring at us. None of us said anything for a long moment. Then Lisa broke the silence. "We're packing up tomorrow morning," she said firmly. No one argued. That night I barely slept. Every little sound outside the tent made me jump. I kept thinking about Emily's footsteps and the whistling. Around 3 a.m. I heard it again. The whistling. This time it was right outside our campsite. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had gone out, and the whistling stopped the second I stepped outside. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I swept the beam of light around. Nothing. No footprints. No animals. Nothing. The next morning we packed up and left as fast as we could. On the way out we passed a ranger station and decided to report what we'd seen and heard. The ranger listened, nodded, and said something that made my stomach drop. "You're not the first to tell me about that. Other campers have seen the fire and heard the whistling too. No one knows who or what it is, but it's been happening for years. We haven't been back to that lake since. And if anyone ever asks me about it, I tell them the same thing: don't go. It's not worth finding out who's on the other side of the lake.